Thank you very much, Helena, for that kind and warm introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here today and having the opportunity to share with you some of the research we are doing at the Oxford Martin School, where we try to understand how technology is reshaping the world of work and what that might mean for the future. Some of you may be old enough to remember the 1990s, when the web had just arrived, when email had just arrived, and journalists, pundits, academics wildly predicted the end of the office and the death of cities. In 2004, Tom Friedman wrote a book proclaiming that the world is flat. We don't any longer have to cluster in cities where housing and real estate is expensive. We can just spread out evenly across space and take advantage of the fact that nature is beautiful. Needless to say, the past couple of decades did not quite turn out that way. If anything, urbanization, even as a consequence of the digital revolution, has accelerated. But many of us still do feel, and as the survey just showed, that there is something different going on this time, and that we are looking for more distributed models of work in the future. But to understand whether that is likely to be the case, I still think we do need to understand why we've been so clustered in recent history more broadly. And that has to do with the cost of moving goods, the cost of moving people, and the cost of moving ideas. In fact, I would argue that these three costs and their interaction with technology can explain quite a bit of the patterns of global economic development that we've seen over the past 200 years or so. Consider Britain in 1800. At the time, most people lived in small communities. Transportation costs were extremely high. The cost of traveling to see people were high. Transmitting information required sending letters. It was almost completely impossible to coordinate communication and production at distance. And as a consequence, production and consumption had to happen at the same place. Most people consumed the goods that were produced within their community. And it was only really with the rise of the steam age, with railroads, with steamships, and later with containers, that Britain could industrialize and ship its goods to the rest of the world, powering the first industrial revolution. That process continued for roughly 2 centuries, up until the 1990s, where you can see that the G7 share of global GDP and trade plummeted. And the reason for this, we all know, is obviously the rise of China and Southeast Asia more broadly. But would it have been possible for China to industrialize so rapidly had it not been for the computer age and the fact that businesses could suddenly coordinate production at distance and take advantage of pools of cheap labor in Southeast Asia? Most certainly not. It was the computer revolution that reduced coordination costs and allowed East Asia to tap into global distribution networks. But at the same time, face-to-face contact costs remained quite high. Of course, the cost of air travel has declined enormously, but over the same period of time, people's wages went up, which meant that the opportunity cost of being stuck at an airport somewhere went up as well. And I think that helps explain why much of the production clustered in Southeast Asia in particular. Most managers prefer to take one trip to China or East Asia rather than having to go to East Asia, to South America, and maybe to other places as well. A key concern, though, going forward among development scholars is whether this growth miracle can be repeated. And part of that has to do with the acceleration that we currently see, even before the pandemic, in automation. Even China has now reached peak manufacturing employment. Roughly 12.5 million manufacturing jobs have disappeared in only 4 years' time as robotization has accelerated. And what this means is that we are likely to see, as we move forward into age of machine learning and smarter machines being capable of performing a much wider set of jobs and tasks, an acceleration of this tendency where a lot of low-skill, low-income jobs that gave many of these developing countries a comparative advantage in production is gradually disappearing. As a result of artificial intelligence, a much wider set of industries and occupations are being affected by automation. And one of the most surprising findings of our research a couple of years ago was that we found that fashion models are actually among the jobs most exposed to automation. A couple of years later, we actually found that that was true, because these models that you can see on the pictures here actually don't exist. They've been generated by what's called generative adversarial networks. They have their own Instagram accounts, and they're already being used in production. But more broadly, the worrying tendency is that it's not the jobs of doctors and lawyers and office managers that are most likely to be replaced. It's low-skill, low-income jobs. And when President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors used our automation probabilities to sort them by wage bracket, what they found is that in occupations where people earn less than $20 a day have a very high average probability of being automatable. Jobs earning more than $40 a day, much less so. And what that means is that businesses are increasingly likely to be able to automate production closer to domestic markets and take advantage of the fact that they can save transportation costs that way. The reshoring wave haven't really yet taken off, but as automation technology progresses, the comparative advantage of cheap labor is gradually disappearing. At the same time, in the age of Microsoft Teams, we are seeing that the very different category of jobs are being affected by technological change as well, and potentially in a much more positive way. On the one hand, we do see that throughout this pandemic, primarily jobs that are quite skilled in financial services and professional service activities have shifted to remote. But at some point, Oxford University might figure out that if I continue to teach remotely, maybe somebody in Delhi could do my job better and at lower costs. And a key concern going forward for advanced economies is that we're potentially in for another wave of offshoring as business processes are being adjusted. And that would not really be too much of a discontinuity, because what we've seen over the past decade or so is that trade in goods on average has stagnated, while services have increased their share, although from a much smaller base. And something that I tend to tell my students is that if you want to understand the future of economic development, we might be better off looking to India than China, because India is one of the few countries that actually managed to grow to middle income status largely by exporting services. And looking forward, we even see that a lot of activities we didn't even think would be possible to coordinate at distance are already happening at distance. Since the 1990s, we see an exponential increase in the average distance between patentees on the same invention. It's clearly the case that even collaboration in innovation can happen at striking distances today. At the same time, though, I think it's important to remember that those inventors had to meet somewhere in the first place in order to decide to set up that collaboration. When important conferences get cancelled, various studies show innovation tends to suffer as a consequence, and I suspect that explains also why there are so many of you here today. But going forward, I think that this does tell us something about the global division of labor and how it's evolving. For me as an academic, when I want to write a new book or a new paper, I want to be out there at conferences, at dinners, to get inputs and gather ideas and explore. But when I've decided on what it is I want to do and I want to execute, I prefer to doing that remotely at my home or some other destination. And I think most projects are that way. They entail a component of exploration and a component of execution. And execution tasks benefits considerably less from being close to other people, from those knowledge spillovers that you get at offices and cities. So I would predict that in the future we are going to see mostly exploration tasks clustered in skilled cities like London and Stockholm. We're going to see more execution tasks being subdivided and potentially moved to the countryside where real estate and labor is cheaper, or potentially even be offshored. And I suspect that is the global division of labor that we're looking at in the future. And I suspect as well that in advanced economies, exploration tasks will become more prominent, because when a task becomes standardized and routinized, it can increasingly be automated and offshored. So more people in this room will continue to engage in innovation activities rather than in execution activities. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so